Early modern Christianity faced a series of mounting crises. The Protestant Catholic division of the Christian European world was concretized in the 1648 Peace of Westphalia, which also set the stage for the modern nation-state. Christianity itself had to grapple with a much wider world filled with apparently righteous non-Christians, and internal to Europe itself arose a philosophical approach which prioritized doubt over faith, matter over spirit, and mechanism over miracle. And to be sure, many Christians sought to answer these problems and others by renovating the traditional tools of scholasticism, a project valiantly, though not really talked about these days much, project led by philosophers such as Francisco Suarez. Others, however, would seek out other and more heterodox and avant-garde philosophies and spiritualities to defend the salvific promise at the heart of Christian piety. And there's perhaps no more extraordinary example of an attempt to produce a universal Christianity assuring salvation for all over and against materialism, atheism, and mechanism than Lady Anne Conway. Her, yes, her, being a 17th century woman philosopher alone marks her out as extraordinary. Her philosophy of Christianity would combine Quaker spirituality with Jewish Kabbalah to produce a brilliant philosophical defense of spiritual salvation over and against the philosophies of Descartes, Hobbes, and Spinoza. Philosophies she felt led to nonsensical mind-body dualism, materialist atheism, and/or pantheism. Lady Conway's philosophy also imagined a religion of reconciliation where not only all Christians, but all religions could find peace and achieve salvation. In this way, she's also something of a precursor to the Theosophical movement. I hope you'll join me as I explore the ingenious religious philosophy of Lady Anne Conway. If you're interested in Theosophy, Hermetic philosophy, Kabbalah, alchemy, or the academic study of the occult, make sure to subscribe and check out my numerous other content on topics in esotericism. Also, if you want to help make this channel possible by supporting my work of providing accessible, scholarly, and free content on topics in esotericism here on YouTube for free, I'd hope you consider supporting my work on Patreon or perhaps with a one-time donation. You can find those links below, and I do really appreciate your consideration for supporting the project of Esoterica. Now, let's turn to an early theosophist of sorts, Lady Anne Conway and her Kabbalistic-infused philosophical theology. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. Anne Finch, eventually to become Lady Conway, was born on the 14th of December, 1631. That's 390 years ago next week, if you're watching this episode when it first appears, in London to an aristocratic family. Like virtually all women of her time, including even aristocratic women, she received only the most rudimentary official education. For instance, she wasn't allowed to learn Latin and Greek or Hebrew or mathematics much, making her later intellectual achievements all the more impressive. While her brother studied at the University of Cambridge, she made the acquaintance of one of his teachers, Henry More, a member of what scholars now refer to as the Cambridge Platonists. Now, this circle of philosophers was more united with what they stood against, primarily the dualism of Descartes, the materialist mechanistic philosophy of Hobbes, and atheism in general, than any sort of unifying set of doctrines aside from a vague orbit around Renaissance-style Neoplatonism. More, recognizing Anne's incredible intellectual prowess, began a correspondence philosophy education with her, focusing primarily on the philosophy of Descartes, at the time the cutting edge of European thought. Now, not only did More begin Anne with Descartes, but rather than start with the more accessible meditations or discourses, the I think, therefore I am bit, they plunged directly into the much more difficult and mature 1644 Principia Philosophiae, a text most students don't really encounter now until graduate school. Anne came to deeply grasp and appreciate the rigor of Descartes' analysis, but also came to be equally critical of the mind-body dualism at the heart of his metaphysics. And of course, this problem was well known in his time as well. In fact, her own philosophical project would be a frontal assault. She refers to her philosophy as an anti-Cartesianism on this particular issue in the very Cartesian philosophy. Of course, she would go on to marry some fancy fella named Edward Conway, whose family's private library was actually among the best in England at the time. Edward, from what we can tell, actually encouraged and supported his wife's intellectual pursuits, so well done, Edward. Well done, old chap. Sadly, along with her profound intellect, Lady Anne Conway also suffered from frail health and was prone to increasingly debilitating headaches. These headaches were so profoundly agonizing that she subjected herself to a range of dangerous attempts at cures, including salivation via mercurial compounds. Yes, they tried to cure her with giving her mercury, which can't cure you, but almost certainly contributed to her declining health. She even traveled to France in April of 1656 to be trepanned. Trephination, if you don't know, is where a hole is drilled into the skull with virtually no anesthetic, at least not at that time. A section of the skull would be removed in the hopes that it would provide some therapeutic effect. When she arrived, no one dared, drill a hole into the head of a major aristocrat, so they did the next most rational thing, medically speaking. They tapped her jugular vein in what has to be one of the most dangerous forms of bloodletting imaginable. They opened up her jugular vein. You're getting a sense of how bad these headaches were, right? This is what she was willing to go through to treat them. In fact, headaches seem to be a conspicuous aspect of several historical women philosophers and mystics, from Hildegard of Bingen to Lady Anne Conway to Simone Weil in the 20th century. That said, headaches and mysticism would make a really interesting future episode for the channel. After returning to England in hopes of treatment, she would eventually meet the alchemist, doctor, and Kabbalist Francis Mercury von Helmont, himself worthy of an episode himself. Despite his being unable to treat her headaches, he did introduce her to ideas that would become central to her own philosophical project. In fact, he became a kind of live-in tutor, doctor, and eventually posthumous publisher for Lady Conway. Sadly, her condition would only worsen. Thanks, mercury medicine and bloodletting, until she could only really hold bedridden salons. Toward the end of her life, she came to accept the highly controversial teachings of Quakerism and composed her only surviving philosophical text. Again, this shows her enormous intellectual and spiritual independence. The acceptance of Quakerism in the mid to late 17th century was just about the worst thing you could do beside being a witch or being a woman intellectual. Those two things probably basically overlapped in the minds of the Inquisition. Composed in English originally, her Principles of the Most Ancient and Modern Philosophy was translated into Latin and then published anonymously and posthumously, as I mentioned, by von Helmont in 1690 over in Amsterdam, and then translated back into English from the Latin translation. The original manuscript had somehow got lost in the shuffle and then published again in English in 1692. Conway's treatise, while only about 140 pages in the original Latin, is a highly original and brilliant assault on Cartesian dualism, Hobbesian materialist mechanism, and Spinozist pantheism, all in the interest of forwarding a vision of the famed Prisca Theologia using the tools of theology, philosophy, and Kabbalah. In fact, she may be one of the earliest European women intellectuals for which we have actual sustained evidence of the study and use of Kabbalistic ideas. In this way, I think Lady Anne Conway can really be said to be a forerunner of both Christian universalism and also of theosophical thought. While von Helmont likely published her work anonymously to get it published at all, no one in the 17th century was going to really publish a book by a woman. Really, he actually made it look as if he wrote it, which one can debate the merits of that. This eventually led to her work languishing in relative obscurity. So much obscurity that both my favorite go-to history of philosophies don't even mention her once in like 10 volumes, and a truly modern edition of her work only appeared in the mid-1990s. Academic philosophy still has this knack for pretending that there weren't any women historical philosophers, or philosophers now, and then just kind of paying them lip service by ceremoniously name-dropping them when people get challenged on that. So like, oh yeah, Anne Conway, she was a philosopher. Do they really know what Anne Conway thought? They don't know. So let's do neither of these frankly offensive and simultaneously boring options and actually get into her very rich and profound religious philosophy. As I mentioned earlier, Conway's philosophical project is to directly counter what she takes to be the rise in three pernicious philosophies: Cartesian mind-body dualism, what she takes to be basically a straightforward metaphysical contradiction, the vision of the world as dead matter in motion in the mechanical ideas from Thomas Hobbes, and the collapse of the divine creator with the non-divine creation into a kind of pantheism by Spinoza. Now, of all these three, she's strongest against Descartes and Hobbes, but she frankly seems to mostly misunderstand Spinoza, like most of her contemporaries, or people now for that matter. I mean, who really gets Spinoza, right? Like, the immediate infinite mode of extension. What in the Hermes Trismegistus are you talking about, Baruch? What are you talking about? The Hebrew heretic aside, Conway launches her attack by deducing ontological structures via various seemingly axiomatic divine attributes. Yes, this is pre-critical philosophy at its finest. Don't think I don't see you smug Kantians in the back and you even more creepy Heideggerians skulking back there murmuring about ontotheology. We're in the Baroque, and Baroque metaphysics for everybody. Cue the harpsichords. Out of the gate, we see the clear Lurianic influence on Conway. Specifically, she seems to be relying on ideas that would later appear in the famous Kabbalah Denudata of Christian Nor van Rosenroth that was printed in Sulzbach in 1677-78, just a couple of years before Lady Conway's death. In fact, the first edition of her work is populated with footnotes, probably added by von Helmont, but maybe in her own original edition, pointing to the origin of her ideas in the Kabbalah Denudata, which again is a compilation of texts like the Zohar and many other relatively famous Kabbalistic texts of the time. She's drawing directly on Kabbalah to form the axiomatic metaphysical substructure of her ideas that will generate in her philosophy. Conway presents three distinct but connected ontological registers, or species as she calls them: that of the Creator, or God, that of Christ, and that of creatures, or the created realm, our realm. These registers are distinct in their unique qualities. The divine is marked by stasis, or remaining unchanged and eternal. Christ is marked by eternality, but can change, while the species of creatures is subject to change or mutability and is bounded by time. The whole system comes to be via an emanationist process and endures eternally as such. From the primordial divine, which Conway denotes as Ein Sof, the infinite, the Kabbalistic, unknowable, infinite Godhead, a contraction is created into which flows the primordial quasi-divine human, or Adam Kadmon, which is also Christ for Conway. Again, clear Kabbalistic ideas here, which in turn emanates an infinite world of living spirit particles as she has them, which in various degrees of attenuation become matter and material creatures, all of which strive toward greater perfection. Now, let's get into the weeds a bit, because that's just basically a summary. So let's see how all this actually works in a bit more detail. For Conway, God is an infinitely remote being marked by stasis and eternality. However, because God is infinitely good and living, this goodness first contracts itself before flowing into the void of that contraction. If that sounds familiar, you've probably studied some Kabbalah. It's basically the concept of Tzimtzum, contraction, found in Lurianic Kabbalah, whereby the infinite light of God is contracted to provide a void wherein creation will flow or emanate. Because the divine is inherently infinite, good, and living, this goodness and life will flow into all the other registers of reality. In fact, this will be the sword drawn principally against Descartes and Hobbes. The second register of reality is the divine image made manifest in the form of the Adam Kadmon, or Christ. This entity acts as a kind of middle nature, as ye have it, which links, like by like, the properties of the divine creator with the non-divine creation. Now, to be sure, this is also where Conway goes toe-to-toe with Spinoza. While there is a spectrum of reality from the divine to Christ to creation, these registers are fundamentally distinct. Thus, our system cannot rightly be called a form of pantheism. Now, one can quibble again with her understanding of Spinoza, but her basic point remains. In her system, God will have properties that will forever make God distinct from all other registers of reality. In this case, it's a distinction of properties that makes a true metaphysical difference. This middle nature, or Christ or Adam Kadmon, partakes of both God's eternality, but like creation is subject to mutability or change. Now, mutability has a very specific meaning in Conway's philosophy. It almost always has the sense of being able to change, but specifically means being able to metaphysically improve or to be capable of metaphysical perfectibility. Thus, Adam Kadmon, or Christ, infinitely improves and are thus worthy of creaturely emulation. It's worthy of us emulating it without ever collapsing into the ultimate state of perfection that is the Godhead, or Ein Sof. As you can probably tell, we are in pretty heterodox Christian territory, but for Conway, this is a feature, not a bug. For her, she saw this version of the Christ-Adam Kadmon middle system as something that both Christians and Jews, and she thought Muslims, though I'm much less sure about that, could actually agree upon. Thus, her philosophy is an attempt at reaching back at a prisca theologia, or primitive theology, which would unite Christians via Christ and Jews via the Adam Kadmon into one peaceful philosophical theology. To be sure, this is a noble, if not mildly naive, goal. Now, it's in the realm of creatures or creation that her philosophy really shines in its originality. Recall that for Conway, all traits of the divine, including infinitude, life, and goodness, are necessarily emanated into all ontological regions of reality. Thus, the species of creation and creatures is necessarily composed of an infinite field of what she calls spirit particles, which are fundamentally alive and good. Conway's system is a kind of fractal ontology where every spirit particle includes within itself an infinitude of further spirit particles, itself within a field of spirit particles whose relative level of attenuation we encounter as solidity or materiality. Contra the Cartesian and Hobbesian world of discrete and inert dead matter set into lifeless motion, Conway's reality is infinitely teeming with life within life, whose solidity is but a compression within the field of fundamental spirit particles. Thus, we can say that while there are three distinct metaphysical species, or ontological categories as she has them, that given certain properties of the divine, the system is fundamentally united in its metaphysical qualities, such as this pan-vitalism. In fact, Conway's infinite system of non-extended spiritual particles directly influenced, you guessed it, Leibniz's theory of the monads, and her ontological vitalism is a precursor to the metaphysics of Bergson, Whitehead, and Deleuze. In many ways, Conway is prefiguring a great deal of ideas that are going to come via rationalism, but also even into places like post-structuralism and early 20th century philosophy. This is really cool. It's also worth pointing out that pain also serves a unique function in her system. Specifically, pain is the experience of a movement away from a greater degree of vitality and goodness, and is thus a reminder to strive for a greater integration with one's actual infinitude through a kind of engaged meditative quietude. This is a bit like Spinoza's as pain as a decrease of power. Of course, this reflects Conway's own attempt to reconcile the idea of a good God with her own profound suffering, perhaps. Here, a Quaker meditative practice locks together with her religious philosophy to grapple with suffering itself, thus creating not only a robust metaphysics, but also a kind of theodicy, an explanation and justification for suffering in a system emanated by a fundamentally good God. Further, Conway also marshals the experience of agony, again likely stemming from her own headaches, against Descartes' mind-body dualism. Just as Elizabeth of the Palatinate, another woman Descartes just casually dismissed, I'm not kidding here, rather than actually answer her philosophical concerns, which were completely legitimate, he basically just urged her not to think so much. Maybe once a year or so, but just don't. He tells her not to think. But yes, Elizabeth and Anne both raised the issue of pain in the mind-body dualism problem in the Cartesian philosophy. Again, many women have raised this. How can it be that sensation, especially pain, can prove to be so powerful that infinite mind has no power over it? Or as my buddy Bill Shakespeare put it in Much Ado About Nothing, there has never been a philosopher who could endure a toothache patiently even though they write as if they had risen above all human suffering and misfortune. Checkmate Stoicism. For Conway, pain, indeed agony, is compelling evidence against Cartesian dualism and shockingly evidence for a fundamentally good, even sublime reality. That pain acts as a signpost to urge one toward divine peace of mind and goodness points to a final interesting aspect, at least for me, of Conway's system. For her, like begets like and also attracts like. Thus, the entire system of spirit particles are infinitely reconfiguring themselves to mirror the divine life and goodness, which they fundamentally are, despite the fact that they will not and cannot achieve such an ultimately good state. Mutability means striving for perfection infinitely, but never really being able to achieve it. This means that even as entities and creatures are composed, suffer, and are decomposed back into the spirit particle field, they're always infinitely tumbling toward perfection, an infinite process performed by infinite spirit particles. Thus, all creatures will eventually become perfected, as much as is possible in this realm of spirit particles, given the infinite expanse of time. Here, Conway is relying on the Kabbalistic concept of Gilgul, or reincarnation, by which all beings seek greater and greater tikkun, or metaphysical restoration, through each good act in each life lived. Now, you might be hearing some echoes of the patristic father origin, And yeah, Conway was really influenced by Origen in his insistence that eventually redemption would come to all beings. He was even claimed that the devil would be redeemed, although he never really said that. This position of apokatastasis, while typically unorthodox in the history of Christianity, is perfectly at home in the world of Lurianic Kabbalah. In fact, no creature, no matter how vile, can ever lose the quality of at least some life and goodness, insofar as they exist as an emanation of the divine life and goodness, thus ensuring that all beings will eventually come to salvific restoration, according to Conway. As I hope you can see, Lady Anne Conway's religious philosophy is a real tour de force. She wed the leading philosophical ideas of the day with those of Kabbalah and Quakerism in order to counter some of the most powerful philosophies of her time. In her sights were Cartesian mind-body dualism, Hobbesian materialist mechanism, and the Pantheism of Spinoza. She took on the greats of the 17th century. The religious philosophy, even Theosophy, she would develop would leave a significant impact on Leibniz and his theory of the Monads, and lays the groundwork for both the emergent mystical philosophies of later centuries, but in many ways the foundations for process metaphysics led by Whitehead, the neo-vitalism of people like Bergson and Deleuze, and the panpsychism proving incredibly popular today. And of course, all of this intellectual and religious work was performed by a woman in profoundly oppressive patriarchal society, all the while beset with the constant agony of headaches and their cures. Truly, we have a chronically ill, disabled woman taking on and developing a truly avant-garde, Kabbalistically infused philosophy over and against a dominant society that would have her say basically nothing, but directly engage with the dominant voices of 17th century philosophy. While I can't personally admit to being convinced by Conway's philosophical outlook, it's still a work of breathtaking genius, and it's for that reason all the more enragingly pitiful that her philosophical project is basically unknown in academic philosophy and simply goes untaught. Hopefully this episode is a small part of a tikkun, or reparation, for that sin of philosophical oversight. The standard study of Conway's thought and her influence can be found in Sarah Hutton's understatedly titled Anne Conway, a Woman Philosopher, while the standard edition of her work, The Principles of the Most Ancient and Modern Philosophy, is published in the Cambridge Text in the History of Philosophy by Kuder and Course. I'll also put a link in the description if you want to take a look at the first Latin edition of her work as well. Again, make sure to subscribe, check out my other content on topics in esotericism, and I hope you consider supporting my work of making scholarly and free content like this on topics in esotericism, or just obscure aspects of the history of philosophy and how they intersect with esotericism. I'd hope you support my work on Patreon or with a one-time donation. Again, you can find those links below. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explored the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.